to drift off to sleep in peace. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. Imagine a world without heaters, without woven fabric pulled from a factory, without a single spark from a lighter. Imagine the sun rising over endless sheets of ice that stretch farther than any eye can see, where the air itself seems to bite, and where survival is decided not by tools bought or built in a workshop, but by knowledge carried in memory, by hands that know fire, and by bonds between people that run deeper than blood. This is the story of how our ancestors lived through the longest winter our species has ever known, not with steel, not with electricity, not with anything we would call technology today. They survived with fire they carried like a sacred flame, with skins they turned into second bodies, with words passed from elder to child, and with a courage that modern comfort has almost made us forget. This is the story of the Ice Age, and of the humans who refused to disappear inside it. Chapter 1: The World Turns Cold. Long before written history, the Earth began to change in ways no living creature had ever experienced. Around 2.6 million years ago, the planet entered a series of cycles that scientists now call the Pleistocene glaciations, a period marked by repeated advances and retreats of massive ice sheets across the northern and southern hemispheres. These were not sudden events. They unfolded over thousands of years, driven by slow shifts in the Earth's orbit, its tilt, and the way sunlight fell across its surface. As global temperatures dropped, water that once flowed freely in oceans and rivers became locked away in growing glaciers. Sea levels fell. Landscapes that had been forests turned into open grasslands, and grasslands turned into frozen steppe. For the early ancestors of humanity, this was not a single winter to endure and forget. It was a new and lasting reality. The last glacial period, often called the last glacial maximum, reached its peak around 20,000 years ago, when ice sheets in the northern hemisphere grew so vast that they covered much of what is now Canada, Scandinavia, and northern Europe under ice more than a mile thick in places. Britain was connected to mainland Europe by dry land. Siberia and Alaska were joined by a wide corridor of exposed earth known as Beringia. The world's map, as we would recognize it today, simply did not exist. Coastlines were different. Rivers ran through valleys now hidden beneath the sea. Entire ecosystems that no longer exist anywhere on Earth thrived across what is now called the Mammoth Steppe, a cold, dry grassland stretching from Western Europe all the way to North America. This was the world into which early humans, and the species that came before us, were born. Homo erectus had already learned to walk into colder climates long before our own species existed, spreading out of Africa hundreds of thousands of years earlier. Neanderthals, who evolved in Europe and Western Asia, developed bodies built for cold, stockier and more muscular than early modern humans, with shorter limbs that conserved heat more efficiently. And when Homo sapiens eventually moved out of Africa, in waves beginning more than 70,000 years ago, they walked into landscapes shaped entirely by ice. To understand how humans survived this era, we first have to understand what they were surviving. Winters in glacial Europe and Asia were not simply colder versions of today's winters. Temperatures in some regions could sit far below freezing for months without relief. Wind swept unbroken across open plains with nothing to slow it down. Daylight in northern latitudes shrank to a handful of hours during winter months. Food sources that depended on soft vegetation vanished for much of the year. And yet, across this unforgiving landscape, large herds of grazing animals still moved. Woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant deer, bison, and wild horses, all adapted to the cold in their own ways, all offering both food and the raw materials of survival to any group clever enough and patient enough to take them. Humans were not the strongest creatures on this landscape. They were not the fastest, nor the best insulated by nature. What they carried instead was something rarer: the ability to learn, to remember, to cooperate, and to pass knowledge from one generation into the next. This was the beginning of a story not about brute strength against nature, but about ingenuity, endurance, and the quiet, extraordinary discipline of staying alive one winter at a time. Chapter 2: The First Virus. If there is one single discovery that changed the fate of humanity in the cold more than any other, it is fire. Evidence of controlled fire use stretches back at least 1,000,000 years, with sites such as Wonderwork Cave in South Africa suggesting even earlier control, though clear and widespread evidence of habitual fire becomes much more common around 400,000 years ago among archaic humans in Europe, Asia. By the time the coldest phases of the last ice age arrived, fire was no longer a rare event stumbled upon after a lightning strike. It had become something humans actively created, carried, protected, and depended on as a matter of daily survival. Fire changed everything about how humans experienced cold. Before its mastery, a drop in temperature after sunset meant retreating into whatever shelter was available and waiting out the darkness in discomfort, vulnerable to both cold and predators. With fire, night became survivable. A burning hearth at the mouth of a cave or inside a shelter provided warmth that could keep a small group alive through temperatures that would otherwise kill within hours. It pushed back the darkness, which meant it also pushed back the predators that hunted in it: cave hyenas, wolves, and the great cats that once shared these frozen landscapes with early humans. But fire's importance went far beyond warmth and light. It transformed food itself. Cooking meat and roots made them easier to chew and digest, released more calories from the same amount of food, and killed many of the parasites and bacteria that made raw meat dangerous, especially meat from animals that had died of natural causes or been scavenged. In a world where every calorie mattered, and where a single illness could be fatal without medicine, this advantage cannot be overstated. Some researchers argue that the mastery of cooking changed human digestion and even human anatomy over evolutionary time, allowing for smaller digestive tracts and freeing up energy that could be used elsewhere in the body, including the brain. Fire also reshaped the social world of early humans. A hearth is not simply a heat source, it is a gathering point. Archaeological sites from across glacial Europe show the same pattern again and again: tools, bones, and debris clustered tightly around ancient fire pits. Evidence that families and small bands spent long hours sitting close together around the flame. It was very likely around these fires that stories were told, skills were taught, songs may have been sung, and the shared knowledge that kept a group alive through the winter was passed from the old to the young. In this way, fire did not just keep bodies warm, it kept communities together. Making fire and keeping it alive were not simple tasks in a world without matches or lighters. Early humans likely used two primary methods: friction, striking dry wood against dry wood, or spinning a wooden shaft against a base to generate heat through friction, and percussion, striking certain stones, like pyrite or flint, against one another to create sparks that could catch specialty. Prepared tinder, such as dried fungus, moss, or fine plant fibers. Archaeological finds of pyrite nodules with clear striking marks, discovered alongside flint tools at Neanderthal sites in France, suggest that percussion, fire starting using stone, was already a known technique tens of thousands of years before the coldest parts of the last ice age. Yet starting a fire from nothing was slow and uncertain work, especially in wet or extremely cold conditions. Because of this, many groups likely avoided letting fires go out at all whenever possible. Embers could be carefully banked in ash and kept smoldering overnight, or even carried from one camp to the next wrapped in bark, or protected in some kind of container, preserving a flame across days of travel rather than risking the difficult task of starting anew each time. In this sense, fire was treated less like a tool to be made on demand and more like a living thing, something to be tended, protected, and carried forward, almost like an unspoken member of the group whose survival was tied directly to their own. Chapter 3: A Second Skin. Human skin, unlike that of a woolly mammoth or an Arctic fox, offers almost no natural protection against extreme cold. We are, in the truest sense, tropical animals by design, evolved in the warmth of Africa, with sweat glands built for cooling, rather than fur built for insulation. To survive in glacial Europe and Asia, humans had to solve a problem that no anatomy could solve on its own. They had to create an artificial layer between their bodies and the world. In other words, they had to invent clothing. The earliest clothing likely did not look like anything we would recognize as a garment. It probably began as simple draped hides, the skin of a hunted animal thrown over the shoulders, or wrapped around the body for warmth, requiring nothing more than a sharp stone tool to remove the skin from the carcass. This kind of loose, wrapped clothing offered real protection, but it had limits. It could slip, gap, and let cold air reach bare skin at the edges, especially around the arms, legs, and neck, and it left the wearer without freedom of movement for tasks like hunting or climbing. The breakthrough that changed this came in the form of a tool, so small it is easy to overlook: the eyed needle. Made from bone ivory, or antler, and carefully ground down to a fine point, with a tiny hole pierced near one end, eyed needles allowed early humans to do something draped hides never could. They allowed people to sew. With a needle and sinew or plant fiber thread, hides could be cut and stitched into fitted garments, close-fitting trousers, sleeve tops, hoods, and even footwear shaped to the contours of the human body, rather than simply draped over it. The oldest confirmed eyed needles date to around 40,000 to 45,000 years ago, found at sites in Siberia and later across Europe, and their appearance coincides closely with the ability of Homo sapiens to survive into some of the coldest environments our species had ever encountered. Some researchers have suggested that this single invention, the sewing needle, may have given Homo sapiens a critical advantage over Neanderthals, who left no confirmed evidence of eyed needles or fitted, tailored clothing in the same way. Neanderthals almost certainly wore some form of hide covering. Evidence from stone tools shows clear signs of hide scraping activity, but the tighter, layered, and better insulated clothing made possible by sewing may have allowed Homo sapiens to push into colder territory and survive harsher winters with greater success. Making usable clothing from animal hide was, in itself, a demanding skill requiring real expertise. A freshly removed hide is stiff, greasy, and prone to rotting if not treated properly. Early humans developed methods of scraping hides clean of flesh and fat using specialized stone tools, then working the skin by hand, stretching, chewing in some documented ethnographic cases among later cold climate peoples, or treating it with substances like animal fat or brains to keep the fibers soft and flexible, rather than allowing them to dry into something as stiff and useless as a board. This process, sometimes called hide tanning or hide dressing, could take days of continuous work for a single usable skin, and an adult living through a glacial winter likely needed several layers and several types of hide: thick fur from large animals like reindeer or bison for outer layers, softer, more supple skin for garments worn against the body. Clothing also had to account for extremities, since the human body loses heat fastest through the head, hands, and feet. Evidence from burial sites, including a remarkable set of graves at Sungyur in Russia dating back roughly 30,000 years, shows rows of ivory beads arranged in patterns consistent with have once been sewn onto clothing, suggesting sleeves, hats, and possibly even fitted boots decorated and constructed with real skill. Footwear itself left behind almost no direct physical evidence, since organic materials like hide rarely survive tens of thousands of years, but subtle clues, including changes in the small bones of the foot in some ancient skeletons consistent with the support of a shoe, rather than a bare foot, suggest that some form of footwear was already in use deep in the Ice Age. In this way, clothing became something far more sophisticated than a simple covering. It became engineered insulation, built in layers, shaped to the body, and constructed through skill passed down across generations. Every stitch represented hours of labor and inherited knowledge. Every hood, sleeve, and boot represented the accumulated understanding of how to keep a human body alive in conditions the human body was never naturally built to endure. Chapter 4: Shelter from an Endless Winter. A fire could warm a body and clothing could insulate it, but without shelter from wind, snow, and the open sky, neither was enough to guarantee survival through an Ice Age night. Shelter had to do more than simply block the weather. It had to trap warmth, resist collapse under snow. In many regions, be built from whatever materials the harsh landscape actually provided, since dense forests full of timber were often nowhere to be found on the open steppe. In regions with natural rock formations, caves and rock shelters offered an obvious and heavily used advantage. They provided walls and a roof already built by nature, protection from wind and precipitation, and in many cases, a relatively stable internal temperature compared to the brutal swings of the open air outside. Sites like those in the Dordogne region of France, including the caves near Les Assises, show long-term, repeated human habitation stretching across thousands of years, with layer upon layer of hearts, tools, and bones left behind by generation after generation who return to the same shelters. Again and again, caves were not permanent year-round homes for most groups, since food sources shifted with the seasons and herds moved with them, but they served as vital, reliable anchor points, especially through the harshest months of deep winter. But not every region offered caves, and across the open mammoth steppe of Ukraine, Russia, and Siberia, humans faced a landscape with few trees and few natural shelters of any kind. Here, in one of the most remarkable adaptations of the entire Ice Age, humans turned to the very animals they hunted for the raw materials of shelter. At sites such as Mesirich in Ukraine, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of dwellings built substantially from mammoth bones, large leg bones and skulls arranged to form a supporting frame, likely covered with hides stretched over the top and weighted down at the edges with more bone and packed earth or snow. Building such a structure required not only physical labor but real architectural understanding, knowing which bones could bear weight, how to arrange them so the structure would not collapse under snow load, and how to seal the covering tightly enough to keep wind and cold air from finding their way inside. Inside these shelters, whether cave or bone and hide dwelling, hearths were placed carefully, often near the entrance to help control smoke while still providing warmth, or centrally positioned to spread heat evenly among the people huddled around it. Excavated sleeping areas sometimes show evidence of bedding, in the form of preserved impressions in ash or soil, hinting at layers of grass, moss, or additional hides laid down to insulate sleeping bodies from the cold ground beneath them, since heat loss to the earth below could be just as dangerous as heat loss to the air above. Group size within these shelters also mattered enormously. A single person sleeping alone loses body heat rapidly, but a group of people sleeping close together conserves warmth far more efficiently, sharing body heat between each other in a way that could mean the difference between a survivable night and a fatal one. Many Ice Age dwellings, based on their modest size, appear to have housed extended family groups, likely ranging from a handful of individuals to a few dozen, close enough in both space and relationship to share warmth, food, labor, and the enormous burden of simply making it through another winter together. Shelter, in this sense, was never only about architecture. It was about the deliberate, learned choice to live close, to build with whatever the land provided, and to treat every hearth and every wall, whether stone, bone, or hide, as a shared investment in the survival of the entire group, rather than any single person alone. Chapter 5: The Hunt on the Frozen Plain. Across the Mammoth Steppe, survival depended overwhelmingly on one central relationship, the one between humans and the great herds of grazing animals that shared their frozen world. Woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, reindeer, wild horses, bison and giant deer moved in seasonal patterns across the open grassland, and for the humans who lived there, these animals represented far more than meat. They represented fuel, clothing, tools, and shelter, all wrapped into a single, dangerous, and essential source: survival. Hunting animals of this size and speed without metal weapons, without bows in many earlier periods, and without any of the tools we associate with modern hunting, required extraordinary skill, patience, and cooperation. Early hunting weapons included wooden spears, sometimes fire-hardened at the tip for added strength, and later, stone-tipped spears using carefully napped points attached to wooden shafts with sinew and natural adhesives like heated pine resin or birch tar. A major leap forward came with the invention of the spear thrower, a simple hooked device that extended the effective length of a hunter's arm, allowing spears to be thrown with far greater force and distance, giving hunters a crucial edge in both power and safety when confronting dangerous, powerful animals. Even with these tools, taking down an animal as large as a mammoth or a woolly rhinoceros was not a task for a single hunter acting alone. Evidence from mammoth kill and butchery sites, along with what we know from more recent ethnographic studies of cold climate hunting societies, suggests that large game hunting was almost always a coordinated group effort. Hunters likely used knowledge of terrain and animal behavior to their advantage, driving animals toward natural bottlenecks, steep drops, riverbanks, or bogs where their movement became restricted and hunters could approach with far less risk than a direct chase across open ground. Patience mattered as much as courage. Successful hunts often depended on tracking herds over long distances, reading subtle signs in trampled grass, droppings, or disturbed snow, and waiting for the precise right moment when the risk to the hunters was lowest and the chance of success was highest. Once an animal was successfully killed, the real work had only just begun. Butchery had to happen quickly and efficiently, using stone tools carefully shaped for the task, since meat left too long could spoil, and a group's entire winter survival might depend on preserving as much of that single kill as possible. Nothing about the animal was treated as waste. Meat was cut into portions for immediate eating, and for drying or smoking over fire to preserve it for the weeks and months ahead. Fat, especially the fat surrounding organs and beneath the skin, was carefully saved, since fat provided the dense caloric energy the human body desperately needed to survive extreme cold, arguably even more critically than meat alone. Hide was removed and set aside for the labor-intensive process of tanning into clothing and shelter coverings. Bones were saved for construction, as seen in the mammoth bone dwellings of the open steppe, and also carefully shaped into tools, needles, awls, and points. Even sinew, the tough connective tissue running along an animal's back and legs, was pulled and dried to become thread and cordage, used for everything from sewing clothing to lashing spear points onto wooden shafts. This deep and total use of every hunted animal reflects something essential about how humans survived the Ice Age, in an environment where every calorie, every material, and every hour of labor carried enormous weight. Nothing could be wasted. A single successful mammoth hunt might sustain an entire group for weeks, and provide the raw materials for clothing and shelter that would last for months, or even years beyond that. The hunt, then, was never simply about food. It was the foundation on which nearly every other aspect of Ice Age survival, from the clothes on a person's back to the bones over their head, was ultimately built. Chapter 6: Knowledge Carried in Memory. In a world without written language, without books, and without any way to record information beyond human memory itself, knowledge had to be preserved and transmitted in an entirely different way, through direct, careful teaching from one generation to the next. Every skill required for survival, starting a fire, tanning a hide, tracking an animal, reading the coming weather in the sky, sewing a hood tight enough to keep out the wind, had to be learned by watching, practicing, failing, and trying again under the guidance of someone older and more experienced. This process of learning was almost certainly constant and deeply embedded in daily life, rather than set apart as formal instruction. Children likely spent enormous amounts of time alongside adults, watching a hide being scraped, observing how a spear point was carefully struck from a stone core, listening to stories told around the fire that carried practical lessons wrapped inside memorable narrative, information about where certain animals migrated in specific seasons, which plants were safe to eat and which were dangerous, or which routes across the landscape were passable and which held hidden danger. Anthropological studies of more recent hunter-gatherer societies living in demanding environments consistently show this same pattern. Survival knowledge is rarely taught through explicit lecture, but through years of embedded apprenticeship, correction, and repetition. The archaeological record offers striking evidence that this knowledge was not only practical, but also, in some cases, remarkably precise and specialized. The consistency of stone tool styles across vast regions and long stretches of time, sometimes centuries, suggests that specific techniques were being carefully taught and faithfully reproduced rather than reinvented by each new generation from scratch. Certain tool traditions, like the sophisticated blade technology associated with the broader Upper Paleolithic period in Europe, show a level of standardization that points strongly toward deliberate, structured skill transmission across many generations of toolmakers. Symbolic behavior and art also appear deeply woven into Ice Age life, and many researchers believe these were not separate from survival knowledge, but closely connected to it. The cave paintings found at sites like Lastox and Chalvet in France, dating back tens of thousands of years, depict animals such as horses, bison, and mammoths with striking anatomical accuracy, suggesting artists who had spent countless hours closely observing these animals, almost certainly same close observation that made them successful hunters. Some researchers argue that these images may have served purposes beyond simple decoration, potentially playing a role in teaching, ritual, or the passing down of critical knowledge about animal behavior and hunting strategy to younger members of the group. While we can never know with certainty the full meaning these images held for the people who made them, their sheer skill and consistency across so many sites reflect a society deeply invested in observation, memory, and the careful transmission of understanding. Language itself, though it leaves no direct physical trace for archaeologists to uncover, must have been the single most powerful tool of all. The ability to describe a hunting strategy before setting out, to warn of danger, to pass down abstract knowledge about seasons and animal migrations that a person might personally experience only a handful of times across an entire lifetime, gave humans an advantage no other species on the frozen steppe possessed. Where a wolf pack could only rely on instinct refined over evolutionary time, humans could rely on accumulated, spoken experience, refined and adjusted within a single lifetime, and shared instantly with an entire group. In this sense, memory itself, carried in stories, demonstrations, and careful instruction, functioned as one of the most essential survival tools of the entire Ice Age, arguably as vital to human survival as fire, clothing, or the hunt itself. Chapter 7: The Strength of Numbers. No single person, no matter how skilled, how strong, or how experienced, could survive an Ice Age winter entirely alone. Cooperation was not a cultural preference among early humans. It was an absolute biological necessity, woven into every part of how communities were structured and how daily life was organized across the coldest and harshest stretches of the year. Group living offered immediate and obvious practical advantages. Hunting large, dangerous animals safely required multiple people working in close coordination, some driving prey toward an ambush point, others waiting with spears ready at the critical moment. Watching for predators, whether cave lions, wolves, or hyenas, was far easier and far safer when responsibility could be shared and rotated among several alert adults, rather than resting on the shoulders of one exhausted individual. Caring for the very young, the injured, and the elderly, none of whom could reliably hunt, gather, or defend themselves, required the collective effort and resources of the wider group, since a smaller family unit alone might not have the labor or supplies to support members who could not fully contribute to daily survival. Archaeological evidence suggests that Ice Age human groups were often organized as small, closely related bands, but importantly, these bands do not appear to have existed in complete isolation from one another. Evidence of long-distance trade and material exchange has been found across numerous Ice Age sites, in the form of materials like seashells, certain rare stone types, or worked ivory discovered hundreds of kilometers from their known points of origin. This suggests that separate bands maintained regular, and at least at times, cooperative contact with one another, potentially exchanging goods, arranging marriages between groups, or offering mutual support during periods of resource scarcity or unusually harsh conditions. Some researchers have argued that this kind of wider social network, connecting bands across a broader region, may have served as a critical form of long-term insurance, allowing groups facing a bad season or a failed hunt to draw on relationships with more distant allies rather than facing catastrophe entirely alone. Within these bands, evidence increasingly suggests that labor and roles were divided based on ability, age, and circumstance, rather than following any single rigid pattern uniformly across every group and every period. Skeletal analysis from numerous sites shows signs of physical strain consistent with intense physical activity across many individuals, both male and female, challenging any assumption of one universal division of labor, and suggesting that survival tasks were, in many cases, distributed based on practical need and individual capability, rather than strict and unchanging convention. Care for the vulnerable also appears clearly and repeatedly in the archaeological record. Perhaps most remarkably, skeletal remains have been found showing evidence of individuals who survived for extended periods after suffering severe injuries or disabilities. Injuries that would have made independent survival essentially impossible without significant ongoing support from others. One widely cited example is a Neanderthal skeleton from Shanidar Cave in what is now Iraq, showing evidence of a withered arm, deafness, and other serious impairments. Yet this individual clearly lived for years after these injuries occurred, a finding strongly suggesting sustained care and support from the surrounding community. Whatever the precise details of any individual case, this broader pattern across sites points towards something significant. Survival in the Ice Age depended not only on strength and self-reliance, but on a deep and consistent willingness to support those within the group who could not fully support themselves. In the end, the human ability to form bonds, to divide labor, to care for the injured and the aging, and to maintain connections across even distant, unrelated groups may have been just as critical to weathering the Ice Age as fire, clothing, or any hunting weapon ever crafted from stone or bone. Where the cold sought constantly to isolate and to kill, humans consistently responded by binding themselves closer together. Chapter 8: Reading the Sky and the Seasons. Survival through an ice age winter required more than reacting to conditions as they happened. It required anticipation, the ability to prepare weeks or even months in advance for changes that could not be stopped or negotiated with, only endured. This meant that early humans needed to develop a deep, practical understanding of seasonal patterns, animal behavior, and environmental signals, essentially building an unwritten calendar carried entirely in observation and memory. Animal migration patterns were one of the most critical pieces of this understanding. Herds of reindeer, horses, and other grazing animals moved across the landscape in broadly predictable seasonal patterns, following the availability of grazing land as it shifted with the changing seasons. Groups that failed to correctly anticipate these movements risked missing crucial hunting opportunities entirely, a mistake that could mean the difference between a stocked winter store of dried meat and a season of dangerous scarcity. Evidence from certain sites, including large accumulations of reindeer remains at specific locations, correlating with known natural migration routes, strongly suggests that human groups positioned themselves deliberately and strategically along these paths, arriving in advance of the herds based on accumulated experience passed down through many previous years and, quite likely, many previous generations. Plant knowledge, though leaving far less obvious archaeological trace than large game hunting, almost certainly played an important supplementary role as well, particularly during the short window of the warmer months. Berries, edible roots, nuts, and other seasonal plant foods would have been gathered avidly whenever and wherever available, and knowledge of exactly which plants were safe, which were dangerous, and precisely when and where each species could reliably be found, represented yet another critical layer of practical, hard-won survival knowledge. Weather itself, though impossible to predict with anything resembling modern accuracy, could still be read to a meaningful degree through patient observation of accumulated experience. Shifts in wind direction, changes in cloud formation, and the behavior of animals and birds could offer early hints of an approaching storm, giving a group crucial extra time to reach shelter or to secure a hearth before conditions turned dangerous. None of this depended on anything we would recognize as scientific instrumentation. It depended entirely on generations of careful, attentive observation, refined and quietly corrected year after year, then carefully passed down through direct teaching from the old to the young. Perhaps most impressively, there is compelling evidence that some Ice Age groups tracked longer, more complex patterns of time itself. Certain researchers have proposed that specific patterns of markings found on portable bone and antler objects, most famously an engraved bone from Abribantard in France, may represent an early lunar calendar, a sequence of marks corresponding to the changing phases of the moon across roughly 2 months. While this interpretation remains genuinely debated among specialists, and caution is always warranted with evidence this ancient and this open to interpretation, the broader idea it points toward is consistent with everything else we know. Ice Age humans were paying extremely close attention to the passage of time and to cyclical, recurring natural patterns, and they were very likely finding ways, however rudimentary, to record and preserve at least some of what they had carefully learned. This ability to anticipate rather than merely react may be one of the most underappreciated aspects of Ice Age survival. It required patience, sustained attention, and the accumulated wisdom of many years and many observers combined together. It transformed the passing seasons from a constant source of danger and uncertainty into something at least partially predictable, and, in an environment as unforgiving as the glacial steppe, that margin of predictability could very often mean the critical difference between life and death. Chapter 9: The Long Tao. The last ice age did not end suddenly. Beginning around 19,000 years ago, and continuing in fits and starts across thousands of years, global temperatures began a long, uneven climb, punctuated by sharp cold snaps, like the Younger Dryas period, roughly 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, when temperatures plunged again sharply for centuries. Before finally, and this time more permanently, giving way to the warmer world we now call the Holocene, the geological epoch in which we still live today. This warming reshaped nearly everything about the world Ice Age humans had known and carefully adapted to survive within. Massive ice sheets retreated slowly across thousands of years, releasing enormous volumes of meltwater that raised sea levels dramatically and permanently redrew coastlines across the entire globe. Land bridges like Beringia and the exposed plain connecting Britain to continental Europe gradually disappeared beneath rising seas. The vast, open mammoth steppe, once home to sweeping herds of mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, and other iconic cold-adapted megafauna, slowly transformed into the forests, grasslands, and tundra landscapes far more familiar to us today. Many of the great Ice Age animals that humans had depended on for so long could not adapt quickly enough to this rapid environmental shift, and species like the woolly mammoth and the woolly rhinoceros eventually went extinct, their disappearance driven by a combination of dramatic habitat loss and, quite likely, increased and sustained hunting pressure from human populations that had grown skilled and highly effective at exploiting them. For the human populations living through this transition, adaptation once again became absolutely essential, just as it had been at the height of the deepest cold. Communities that had built their entire way of life around highly mobile, large-game hunting across open plains now had to adjust to entirely new environments and new available food sources. In many regions, this shift meant increasing reliance on fishing, on smaller and more diverse game, and on a much wider range of plant foods as forests slowly expanded and displaced the open tundra and steppe that had dominated for so many thousands of years. In some areas of the world, this same long process of environmental change and increasing human adaptability eventually paved the way toward entirely new ways of life, including, within a few additional 1,000 years, the early beginnings of agriculture, animal domestication, and permanent settlement, developments that would go on to fundamentally reshape the future of the entire human species. Yet even as environments transformed so dramatically around them, the foundational skills carefully developed across the long Ice Age did not simply vanish or become obsolete overnight. Fire-making, hide-working, careful and structured cooperation within tightly knit social groups, oral knowledge transmission across generations, and deep, patient observation of the natural world all remained genuinely essential tools of survival long after the ice itself had retreated. In many ways, the true and lasting legacy of the Ice Age was not any single object or invention. It was the demonstrated and undeniable proof that human beings, working together, learning constantly, and adapting relentlessly, could survive in some of the most extreme conditions our planet has ever produced, all without a single piece of what we would today recognize as advanced technology. Closing. What allowed humans to survive the Ice Age was never a single tool, a single invention, or a single stroke of good fortune. It was the accumulated weight of thousands of small decisions made correctly, over and over, across countless generations. It was a spark carefully protected, and carried from one camp to the next. It was a hide painstakingly scraped, softened, and stitched into something capable of holding back a merciless wind. It was a shelter built from the very bones of the animals that had, in turn, been hunted to provide both food and warmth. It was knowledge spoken aloud around a fire and carefully repeated by careful hands until a child could finally do it correctly, without guidance. And it was, perhaps most importantly of all, the simple, unwavering choice to stay close to one another, to share food, warmth, and labor freely, and to care for those who could not fully care for themselves. There was no advanced technology waiting to save them. There was only human ingenuity, patient observation, and a deep, learned understanding that survival, in the harshest conditions our species has ever faced, was never truly a solitary struggle. It was always, in the end, a shared one. And it is because of the quiet, extraordinary resilience of those who came before us, surviving winter after impossible winter with nut fire, hide, bone, memory, and each other, that any of us are here at all today. Thank you for listening. Please don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment.